Welcome to the second in our seminar series for the autumn. My name is Philippa Woodcock. I'm a lecturer here at the Centre for History, and I'm very pleased to introduce Alison Chand, my colleague, to speak tonight. Before I big up Alison, I have to say that this seminar will be recorded, so I presume you give your consent for this. Right. There will be various people joining us by VC, and I expect that might vary as we go along. Could I ask you, if you are on VC, to keep your mic off until question time so that we don't have any feedback? It happens a lot in seminars with students, and it would be nice just to let Alison have the floor.
With staff as well.
With staff as well, yes. So, I think I've done the legal bit. So, Alison is a freelance oral historian and tutor at the Scottish Oral History Centre, based at the University of Strathclyde. She's also a teaching assistant and my colleague here, mainly specialising in modern history. She completed her PhD in 2012. This focused on the experiences of men working in reserved occupations in Clydeside during the Second World War. Since then, she has worked in various capacities. She's very flexible. She interviews, transcribes, and advises on a range of oral history projects. These are both academic and community-based, and as well as this, she continues to teach oral history at Strathclyde. Her book, Masculinities on Clydeside, was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2016. So, it's my great pleasure to hand over to you, Alison, to give us your paper entitled Exploring Masculinities on Clydeside, Men in Reserved Occupations During the Second World War.
Thank you very much, Philippa, and hello everybody. So the title of the seminar today on exploring masculinities on Clydeside comes from the title of my book, which derived from my PhD, which, as Philippa says, I completed in 2012. Are the slides? Do they come up, or
we'll switch?
Oh, that's great. They can come up just as in phone.
Are you ready for them to
Yes.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Brilliant. So I'll just get them started. Sorry, everybody. There we go. Great. All right. I want to talk just a wee bit about how the whole project really came to life, how the PhD project came into our book, and what the origins of that were. Then take a look at the subject area that I covered within the book, with a focus on the impact of being in a reserved occupation on masculinity. And what that meant to men primarily men in reserved occupations, although I did also speak to a number of women as part of the project. And I'll also take a briefer look at some of the other areas that I covered in the work, such as regional identities specific to Clydeside and the experiences of women in reserved occupations. And also take a look at some of the future research directions I've been looking at out of that afterwards. As I say, the study and the research had its origins as a PhD, which I completed at the Scottish Oral History Centre at Strathclyde between 2009 and 2012. And I worked at Glasgow Museums as well alongside that, and did a placement at the Glasgow Museums Resource Centre, working with their oral history collections and using some of those materials for the project. Since then, as Philippa said, I've continued teaching at Strathclyde had 2 children and have done a variety of freelance work, and in between that sent a book proposal in for this project, which was eventually accepted by Edinburgh University Press and published in July 2016. So came about quite gradually. And was adjusted in the process, but that's a brief outline of how it came about. I want to play a wee quote here, just one that raises some of the ideas that I wanted to explore in the project. I found it at Glasgow, in the collections at Glasgow Museums quite early on in my research.
And that was that started my apprenticeship. And I don't know if you happen to remember, James, young man, how horrific it was working in the shipyards, not having been experienced in that kind of life. But it was awful. I can remember the worst day of my whole life was in February, and walking up the road which now leads to the airport, but I was going to Fleming and Ferguson's, and I arrived there, went on to the boat, which was a massive rust that was cold, it was bitterly cold, damp, no heat, condensation, water dropping off everything, and the smell of carbide throughout the whole ship. There was no electricity, and everyone used carbide lamps. And again, Dickensian, it was 10 times worse than Rattray's. But I worked in the shipyards winter and summer, and I really did hate every minute of it. It was awful. But I did get my apprenticeship completed, and I got out of Charles Rattray's in 1946. That was just after the war. During the war, more or less to get out of Rattray, out of charters rather, than anything else, I volunteered for the Merchant Navy. And I was made very welcome. By gad, yes, what a good idea. Until they found out where I worked. I worked in shipyards, and I was working on minesweepers and destroyers. And the job I was doing was installing, not designing, just installing and connecting the electrics of the Aztec system, the old submarine detection equipment. That doesn't make me a genius or anything. It was just one of those jobs on a ship. But I suppose it sounded good. So I was told I could not join the Merchant Navy as I was in a reserved occupation, work of national importance, and that was that.
So, as I say, I found that quote quite early on in my research. I found that interview quite early on, and it raised quite a lot of ideas that I was quite interested in exploring, like the idea that men in reserved occupations might try and get out of those jobs during the war to do something more directly connected to the war effort. And the idea of a hierarchy of reserved occupations as well. In the Merchant Navy itself is actually a reserved occupation, but perceptions of it were often that it was part of the forces because men wore a uniform and generally went away from home to be part of it. So the idea that some jobs were seen as more important than others, and what the impact on masculinity was of those things. So I felt that this raised quite a few of those ideas, also misunderstandings about what the reserved occupations were, which affected, from the oral sources that I looked at and from the interviews that I carried out, the confusion over what they actually were quite often affected men and how they felt about their jobs. Just by way of... I can get that to move on. There we go. Just by way of brief background to what the reserved occupations actually were, the British National Services Act in September 1939 made men aged between 19 and 41 liable for conscription into the armed forces, and then the National Services No. 2 Act in December 1941 extended that to include men aged between 41 and 51. However, what's less well known is that in 1944, which was the height of conscription for the armed forces in a time when there were 4.5 million servicemen, 10.3 million men like Jim Fife were employed in civil employment in Britain during the war, many not under 18 or over 51, so within those conscription ages. The government began to devise the schedule of reserved occupations as early as 1922 with the intention of preventing the loss of skilled men that occurred from British workplaces during the First World War, and a list of what those occupations were began to be drafted in 1925 and was revised at various stages, later as late as May 1939. There were key categories of reserved occupations, and men were reserved into those categories at different ages. For example, white-collar jobs like banking and insurance had reserved occupations, but usually for men in their 40s, which were much more difficult to assess as part of this project because of the ages of the men involved when I was speaking to them. I think the youngest interviewee that I spoke to was 86, and he was in his early 20s during the war, so looking at how older men experienced being in a reserved occupation was a bit more tricky. Heavy industrial jobs like in the Clydeside area, like shipbuilding, munitions, to an extent in the wider Clydeside area, agriculture, those were the jobs that tended to be occupied by the men that I spoke to. The collections that I looked at were primarily oral history based, and I carried out about 50 new interviews with men who worked in reserved occupations during the war, as well as about 10 with women who worked in reserved occupations over that time period, and also worked quite a bit in existing oral history collections, primarily those at Glasgow museums. The Glasgow Museum's Resource Centre was home to the 2000 Glasgow Lives collection, which was one of the biggest oral history collections that they had, which was a collection of interviews with Glaswegians and Clydesiders of different ages, which was done in advance of the new millennium, and the intention was to collect 2,000. I don't think they got that many, but they had several hundred. And they were in the process of digitising them when I was based there, and it's now a completely digitised collection. So I worked quite extensively with those, as well as with collections at some smaller centres around Clydeside, like the North Lanarkshire Heritage Centre in Motherwell, and smaller museums, the Old Kirk Museum in Kirkintilloch. There were various wee museums round about which had oral history collections that let me go in and root about in the bottom of filing cabinets for tapes. So listened to quite a few that way. So managed to get a bit of a range of different ages and jobs in some of the interviews I listened to and completed. There are a few kind of official statements of importance of the reserved occupations, and cultural depictions of them are often restricted to TV series like Dad's Army, which show men who are either too old or too young or too unfit to be fighting, and don't incorporate young fit men of fighting age who are in civilian work, so that there aren't many sort of cultural representations of those men. So one of the areas that I really was looking to explore as part of this research was that effect of being in a reserved occupation on masculinity, and the extent to which masculinity was linked to military service in wartime. There was quite a lot of evidence that came out of the oral sources that I looked at, that some men did feel guilty and perhaps then emasculated because of not being in the services. And I'll just play this wee quote here, which was from a man called Henry Elder, who was an engineering apprentice during the war at James Howden's factory in Scotland Street in Glasgow. And I'll just play this wee quote from him.
You were talking about the men in the forces, and you said that they were men and different.
That was the thing I felt, because whilst I was an apprentice, I was a youth developing. And the progress was because you weren't a man till you were 21 in those days. You were not a man till you were 21. So that really meant that I was progressive. But when any of the friends or the chaps that lived nearby, when they went to the force, when they came home and leave, they were men. And they were still only 18, but they developed into manhood. Whereas I was still a youth, under various help, if you like, by the fact I was working in a factory. I was still being taught what my engineering experience was going to be. But these can't come back from just a few months away in the forces and they'll come back and they really were men. And I envied that. I did really.
So I think in that quote, and there were others like that, there's a definite link there to development into what Henry Elder saw as a man and military service and being part of the military, and he sees his friends being part of the military, being was more men than he is at the same age. So that sentiment was definitely there in a lot of the interviews. Having said that, other factors that affected masculinity did come out of the interviews as well. And occupational pride, I felt, could provide an alternative as a basis for masculinity, as an alternative to military service for men. Sometimes as a consequence of individual deferment into a particular job, and later on in the course of the war, block reservation was changed to a system of individual deferment where workplaces had to request particular individuals. In these quotes here, we see Harry McGregor, who the first quote on the slide is from Harry McGregor, who worked as an engineer in Glasgow during the war, and said if you hadn't had people working in industry, who was going to supply all the ammunition? And the second quote from Jerry Moffat of a similar vein, he was a shipyard welder in the Govan area of Glasgow, and said that we need people in industry the same as we need people in the forces. So in these kind of scenarios, men were able to feel part of the war effort because of the contribution they were making to the war through work. So I think there was still a linkage here between masculinity and military service, and that the work was linked to the war effort, as demonstrated in extracts like this. But I did also find, sorry, that one's a wee bit smaller, that men in reserved occupations could also adhere, I suppose, if that's the right word, to alternative masculinities with less connection to military service, as shown in some of these examples. So Pat McChrystal, who was a shipwright in Glasgow, said the only interest men had was what was the hourly rate and what was the opportunity for overtime. So there's a real importance there of employment and earning. And I'll say later on, but I'll say it now, Clyde said it was coming out of a period of economic depression, and arguably perhaps the impact on masculinity of not earning was perhaps a more dominant force than not being in the armed forces. Esme Adams, from the second extract on the slide there, was a glass worker at Baron Stroud's factory in Glasgow, said it was a step above the average to say that he worked in Baron Stroud's. So he's suggesting there was a kind of prestige to his workplace, and again coming back to the idea of hierarchy of jobs, of some being seen as maybe more important than others or more masculine than others. And then others expressed a dislike of the idea of actually being in the armed forces at all, and a desire to actually avoid military service, like John Allen, who was the third man there, and I'll actually play his one to you.
In the shipyards, were there many people who tried to get out and join the forces or get another job?
No. And none of them want to go to the forces. No, they're quite happy with it. If they'd been aged for the forces, then they'd have seen a take them. But because of the reserved occupation, so long as you stayed in the shipyards, you want to go to the army. And nobody want to go to the army. Or the Navy, or the Air Force. So they just were quite happy. Well, they were shipyard workers, so they just stayed with it.
So yeah, John Allen clearly was someone who didn't want to be in the military, and he expresses an idea there at the end when he says they were shipyard workers, of a kind of continuity of occupation there. It was a job that he'd worked in before the war, and it was a job that he continued working in after the war, and that kind of longer term continuity was perhaps more important to his own identity than the need to be in the military service and to be in the military services and prove himself that way. Different forms of masculinity and the way that men felt masculine, I think, also could exist alongside each other, and often did within the same interview. And these two quotes here on the slide were both from a man called Robert Martin, who was a moulder by trade and was born in the town of Wishaw in Lanarkshire, and started out. He joined the Territorial Army in 1934 while he was working, and was called up at the start of the war for 13 months as part of that role in the Territorials, before being asked to return to his work as a moulder because of his reservation. And initially, earlier on in the interview, when he was asked about his experiences of the job, he said that earning was the object of us all, actually, and he said in a job it was all about what was the best money, and that was the thing. But then later on, when I asked him how he felt about being called back into his job as a moulder and back into his reserved occupation, he said this.
And how did you feel about being sent home from the army?
Didn't like it. I put in a request to my section officer if I could stay on, and the company officer, the company office was in a marquee at that time. We were under canvas, and the major gave me a real good telling off for even asking that, because they had sent home over 30 people to the mines, because that was very essential to keep the power stations going and put coal into the homes then and all that sort of thing. So 2/3 of them rejoined the forces, and that cut down the amount of miners that we sent home. And the major was very annoyed about that, and I was told in no uncertain terms that I had to do that again.
So he expresses almost two different kinds of ideas there, and that he doesn't like having been returned out of the military service, and thinks that perhaps he's contributing more to the war effort in that role than he is in the job he's sent back to do, but yet also values the earning value that the job provides for him. So both of those kinds of masculinity, if you like, coexist, and that happens within the same interview sort of more than once in some of the ones that I looked at. As well as that, I think, and I've put lived and imagined there in inverted commas, because in talking about masculinity as being linked to military services, it's clearly not imagination is linked to cultural discourses to do with the reserved occupations and the way that the reserved occupations are viewed and the way that military service is viewed. But I felt out of a lot of the interviews the idea that lived everyday existence was a very dominant influence in how men lived their lives and how they shaped their identities. Henry Elder, who we heard from earlier, he said he didn't think his father would have liked him to go into the forces, so there's an influence there on him from family members. And also in the second quote from Jenny Moffat, who we also saw a quote from briefly earlier, the actions of friends and colleagues and the influential nature of those and what people around you are doing on a day-to-day basis, I think were important. And in play, Jenny Moffat, so this is the last one, I'm going to play. Get it down there. It was going so well before.
They'd joined the forces. I mean, it was £5. I don't know if the £5 was an attraction or not, but there was no war at that particular time, but there was always the threat, after that, carried on by the Chamberlain. So they went to join the forces. Well, the Laplacian government they went down, and we all went together. My brother, his pals, my pals went down, and this other fellow and I was at the back. We were the youngest. Paddy McGinty's young brother. So when we went there, they said they wouldn't take any more. Maybe they're only at fivers, I don't know. But there's not any more that night. He says, you go over to York Hill Barracks tomorrow night, and you're going, well, I couldn't go to York Hill Barracks because someone else to do, maybe a girl or something.
Oh, missed the end of that one. But yeah, so he decided to go up and try and join up because he was doing it in a group of friends, he was doing it in a group of family members, and decided not to go the next night, maybe for the same reason, maybe nobody else was going up that night. So the influence of the people around men on a day-to-day basis, I think, shouldn't be underestimated. And I think I found this kind of sentiment much more in the testimonies of men who had worked in quite big industrial workplaces in Glasgow. And I did a few interviews with men who had worked, particularly with one man who had worked as a shepherd in quite a rural part of Lanarkshire, and then moved to work in the Forestry Commission in a different reserved occupation. And in his work as a shepherd, he said he found it quite isolating. He thought about joining up then, but when he moved to work for the Forestry Commission, he thought, no, that this was fine. He quite liked this job, and there were lots of other young men doing the same job. So the impact of numbers of men in reserved occupation, I think, was significant. Also, I touched on this earlier, but I think the masculinity of older men was probably different from those of younger men. As I said, quite difficult to assess that properly through the interviews that I was able to do or even listen to. And the oldest ones in the collections at Glasgow museums went back to were recorded in the 1980s. So there were interviews with some older men there, but relatively few, and those interviews obviously weren't about the reserved occupation, so there were slim pickings in that area. But the first quote on the slide there comes from a woman called Irene Williams, whose father was in a reserved occupation as a shipyard worker in Fairfields shipyard in Glasgow, and at no point in her interview did she question her father's role, and her father, she said, was 37 during the war. At no point did she question the role that her father had in a reserved occupation, but when asked about younger men in reserved occupation, jobs, she said, I suppose there was a lot of young men with trench coats on, but if they weren't at the war, you thought maybe they weren't well enough, maybe they weren't strong enough to pass the test. So suggesting that those younger men weren't fit enough in some way, and not that they were justifiably in civilian employment. different attitudes were also evident between skilled and unskilled workers and people with families and without. And the second man who's quoted on the slide there, James Person, who was a vehicle builder in the Govanhill area of Glasgow, when he was asked in his interview, which was in the Glasgow Museum's collection, if he had thought of joining up, he said he wouldn't have minded, but he had 2 kids, so he didn't want to go for that reason. So the impact of having a family and again being older perhaps affected how he shaped his own masculinity. And men who worked in skilled jobs and unskilled jobs often perceived the work that they were doing differently. So if they were working in a skilled occupation, they saw it as having greater importance towards the war effort. Some men referred to the work that women were doing in the war as being less skilled than theirs as well. And the fact that they were more skilled than women was kind of justifying their position in a reserved occupation. As well, just briefly to look at a few of the other areas that I looked at aside from specifically masculinity, I also looked at different experiences in Britain's regions in wartime, at nationality, and many men talked about their British and their Scottish nationalities, but more often little thought was given to that kind of nationality, and there was more of a kind of, I suppose, so attitude to questions that I asked about that. More often, evidence emerged from interviews of solidarity between different British regions in wartime, and I interviewed a couple of men who lived in Glasgow and Clydeside at the time of carrying out the interviews, but had worked in places like Manchester during the war and other areas with high proportions of men in reserved occupations. So they would talk about experience that they had with those men as being similar to those that they thought men in Clydeside experienced. So there was kind of solidarity with some of those other towns and cities and urban areas within Britain. Perhaps showing the impact of labour mobility in wartime, and also sort of shared attitudes of industrial militancy, which continued from before the war and carried on after the war as well. Although there was, I think, evidence of a distinctive Clydeside experience of the war, and women's testimonies from the Clydeside area often granted working men greater recognition. One woman who I interviewed, who was in the Land Army, talked about there being quite a lot of young male farmers round about her, so was quite comfortable with the idea that there were lots of men working in the area. Obviously, I didn't do extensive oral histories of people in different areas, so again, it's difficult to assess how different that was. But in some diaries of like Nella Last's diary during the war, images presented there of men in reserved occupations tend to fit that picture of men who are too young or too old or too unfit. There was evidence also of pride in industrial Glasgow and Clydeside, some of that linked to the war effort, but some of that also to the continuity of industry in the area, thinking back to some of the comments made by the men in the interview clips that I've played. And men expressed pride in traditions of family employment and also in their involvement in industrial militancy, and did demonstrate an awareness of a very local environment in their daily life. Perhaps some of these ideas reflected, as I said, the high impact of unemployment in areas like Western Scotland, which has been widely documented, perhaps representing a greater level of emasculation than some of the challenges posed by war. So war represented an important reason for increasing employment, and the men were proud of their involvement in that. I also looked at kind of wider identity, and I felt that more extensive research, I found it was quite difficult to look at men and their work without looking at what they did in the rest of their lives. So I wanted to look at, in the interviews, at more private, kind of lived facets of their life, like nationality, and I interviewed a few men of Lithuanian origin or Irish origin. Jerry Moffat, who's some of whose interview extracts I've played, he came from an Irish family background. I asked men about their class identities, their political identities, and particularly tried to explore the idea of a working class consciousness in the Clydeside area, and also asked about religion, which was intricately connected to some of the men of Irish background as well. So a lot of men talked about sectarianism and about attachment to the Protestant and the Catholic religion, and I asked them about their social activities and what they did, and a lot of men talked about playing football, going to dance halls, and again coming back to that impact of people around them on a day-to-day basis. That was something they were quite keen to talk about, is what they did after work, and things that affected them in their everyday life and their day-to-day life, and things within the wartime public consciousness as well, like the blackout and rationing as well. And finally, I also did look at the experiences of women in reserved occupations. The reason for that being, I came into this project, which was already funded and intended to look at the experiences of masculinity, of being in the reserved occupations. But when I advertised for interviewees, I was deluged by calls from women saying, what about us? And we worked in reserved occupations as well. So I actually ended up interviewing quite a few women, around 10 women initially, which found quite interesting. I listened to quite a few interviews with women about their work as well, and a lot of the collection at Glasgow Museums was with women. The majority of those interviews were with women, and it made sense as I found it was difficult to look at the experiences of men in a vacuum anyway. They were interacting in communities with women on a daily basis. So these were some of the key, on the slide there, these are some of the key ideas that came out of the interviews with women. There were a number who said that they wanted to join up to be part of the auxiliary services, and then that idea actually appealed to them and they enjoyed it. There were others who felt that they contributed to the war effort through their work and expressed that sense of wanting to be part of the war effort. And others who said that they were fulfilled through a level of financial independence and enjoyed being able to contribute to family life because of the work that they were doing, and had a new sense of independence. And others still who said that they disliked the work they didn't. They resented being pulled into the workplace. So it's quite a brief whistle-stop tour through women, but I can come back to that in questions. But I explored ideas in talking to them, such as the idea that maybe class awareness in Clydeside was more important than gender difference for some men and women that I spoke to. And again, a focus on, I felt that a focus on continuity came out of the interviews as well, and that a lot of women were interested in things that they did in their lives before the war and they carried on doing after the war. Were keen to talk about whether they had continued in the workplace after the war, or whether they hadn't as well. So I think plurality was one of the main sort of features of masculine identities that came out of some of these interviews that I looked at with men and women in reserved occupations, and I felt like the influences of daily life were very important. I think masculinity was, to an extent, linked to military discourses and linked to the idea of being military service, also to other cultural discourses, particularly in the Clydeside area, linked to employment and earning. And one area that I'd kind of earmarked for future research is that a number of men talked about being in reserved occupations after the war had ended, and the occupations continued to be reserved after the war, which is something at some point when I have time I would like to go back and revisit some of the interview recordings and see if there's any more about that in the existing oral history archives. So to conclude, I think the focus on everyday lives of men in reserved occupations and the different competing masculinities that came out of their oral history testimonies further complicates the picture that emerges of the Second World War from historiography, recent historiography, as an agent of social change, and opens the door, I think, further into how research into individual experiences and community experiences and how individuals fit into communities and the way that individual and collective memories interact, how that fits into the bigger historical picture that's been presented of the Second World War and how far it represented social change. So I think there's room to explore those kinds of experiences in a variety of contexts. I have no idea what the time is, but hopefully I think that's me got through all of that.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you for such a richly supported paper. It makes such a difference to hear the voice of the people. And it was fascinating. My grandfather was in a reserved occupation, but as far as I can understand, he was there because he was very good at shooting rabbits. So it's quite a different kind of experience. Obviously, I'd like to open up the floor to questions. I wonder if anybody has a question from the VC, if they would wave their hands and arms vigorously so that we can see. But maybe whilst you're thinking about that, if there are any questions from the table to start with? Well, might I start with something completely silly? Did it improve? Did they have any perceptions that it improved their chances to get a girlfriend by staying behind? Was this ever mentioned?
Well, I try that the only the thing that springs into my mind about pursuing girls that comes out of it was a resentment of American servicemen, particularly with men that interviewed in Greenock and Gourock who were involved in. I interviewed one man who worked on the river ferries from Gourock and transported servicemen out to ships on the Clyde, and he talked quite a lot, I remember, about not wanting the American service. It affected his chances with the girl. The Americans were more exciting than him. So perhaps there's more of a glamorous depiction there of servicemen. Yeah.
Yes, Ian.
Yeah, I'm glad we got that clarified. That was my first question. Just your final slide, as you were talking, which I found this really interesting, thank you. That the kind of longer term impact on their perceptions of self and perceptions of masculinity over a longer term post-war. I know, is that something you explored in depth, or is that one of the areas that you'd like to go back to?
I'd like to go. I didn't deliberately explore it in depth, but it sort of naturally, because men, they didn't tend to stop talking when their experiences hit 1945. So they did quite, and because a lot of them were younger when they started work, they then continued to work in the same jobs after the war. So it sort of came up in the interviews in a fair amount of depth, almost a bit by accident. Without me intending it to, just by people keeping talking. And a couple of men who I interviewed who were actually not in reserved occupations during the war, but were after the war because they were too young during the war, but then their job... In fact, I think the man in the river ferry who worked in the river ferries I'm talking about, his older brothers had been reserved during the war, and he then was reserved in 1947, I think. Later on, which is something I hadn't known before I started this. The reserved occupations continued afterwards. So I would like to revisit it as well, but it did come up a fair amount in the interviews. Yeah.
Why did the reserved occupations continue?
Because at the time I think there was still a need for people to be in the industry. I think because people were still travelling back from the military in places from maybe places like the Far East, I suppose, and they continued. And I think there was still a need to produce. I think particularly areas like agriculture and things like that, and with the river ferries, there's a continued naval presence. The man I'm thinking of who spoke about being reserved in 1947, he said the ships were continuing to come in, the American ships were carrying on, coming into the Clyde into the 50s. There was still a need for that to happen. I'd like to look at it in more detail to explore actually when that continued up until, because I haven't actually been able to find that out when the reserved occupations actually stopped in the definitive date for that.
And that presumably excused you from national service?
Well, it essentially was your national service. Yeah, they would do it as national service. So it came up with quite a few similar issues in the men who did talk about it to those who spoke about military service and the jobs that they were doing, and that people would ask them why weren't they doing national service, why were they doing this? And I think I went into it with the assumption at the end of the war everything will just return to normal. It was all grand, whereas this did continue for a period of time. For the end point of that, I haven't actually established.
Would I be right in thinking that this did, I don't know how long after the war, excuse me, reserved occupations carried on, because we obviously had, immediately after Hitler's war, we had a war in Burma, and we had a war in Korea.
Yeah.
So there wasn't very much peacetime at that stage.
Mm-hmm.
I think that reserved occupations continued through those periods.
Yeah, they certainly carried on through to the late 50s. I know that much. I'm not, as I say, I'm not sure the definitive point at which they stopped, but I had men within interviews talking about working well into the 50s in reserved occupations. So those wars, in fact, is probably part of the answer to Evie's question about why they were still needed and continued military involvement. Yeah.
David, you had a question. Who was that? Sorry, is there a question on VC?
Yeah, I think it's Brian.
Brian.
Well, maybe if David comes in, I'll come in after David.
Okay, yeah, no, it's just, there's some interesting research that has been done with Scottish women on who had met Poles during the Second World War, and there's quite a positive perception from 1940 to 41. There's one woman who was interviewed in the 80s and said, what did you think of the Poles? I thought they were great, they could dance like Fred Astaire. But then, I wondered actually about broader sources. You mentioned Lithuanian and Irish people with those backgrounds, but what about people who were from Glasgow and their reflections on coming across other ethnicities and other immigrant groups? Did you get a lot of that, or was there a sense of them meeting people from other backgrounds for the first time, particularly those youth? I was thinking of forestry, actually, where it was huge because it was so cosmopolitan during the Second World War.
Yeah, well, I only spoke to the one man who was in the Forestry Commission, and I don't think it was something that he mentioned, but certainly talking about the other nationalities, the Irish in particular, was something that a lot of men did, and I interviewed a couple who were from Irish backgrounds, but I did asking about religion, the political identities that came about, that I was asking about that kind of thing. And I think generally the perception was that they operate socially, people from different nationalities tended to operate in their own communities, but that in the workplace that was different. And there was a sense in some of the interviews, I think, that people who are not so much Irish Protestants, but Irish Catholics were doing dirty work in the workplaces. That came out a fair bit, that they got the worst jobs to do. I'm trying to think if there was anybody Polish that. A lot of people talked about the Lithuanians as Poles, but in terms of actual Polish people, I don't think anybody that I spoke to came from that background. But there was comments on Italian, people of Italian background as well, particularly in the West, and attitudes towards the Italians, not so much in the industrial workplaces, but in some of the talk of day-to-day lives and the people that they came across in dance halls and the people they came across in social activities. So there was a mixing of the communities, I think, to an extent in the workplace, and I think maybe perhaps wartime made that happen to an extent that brought people into the same workplaces who might not otherwise have been in the same workplace.
It wasn't necessarily a negative portrayal of the Italian community, though.
No, I think the portrayal of the Italians was quite positive, I would have said, in the interviews that I came across. Probably the most negative, I think, was of the Irish Catholic community. Not so much in terms of saying negative things about them, but just in saying that they got rubbish jobs to do, they got the worst jobs to do in the factories or in the workplaces that they were in. So almost indirectly talking about other people's negative views without putting those out themselves. Although obviously I think the passage of time will have affected how they put forward their comments to me 6 years ago to how they might have done it in 1946. Thanks.
Brian.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks to Alison. I really enjoyed that. So I was looking forward to this talk. I just wanted to chip in a wee bit of my own experience. My father and his two brothers were all in reserved occupations in Greenock in the shipyards during the war. And the thing is, they were in the yards, but they were also in the Home Guard. And in Greenock, believe it or not, there was a Home Guard band. And I grew up hearing funny stories about the Home Guard band before Dad's Army ever appeared on the television. And I've got a picture in the house. I've got a photograph of the band, and they were all in it. But I suppose the point I was wanting to make was that this idea of kind of emasculation, I never picked up that at all from my relatives. And one of the things my uncle told me was that in the war they were working day and night. They were working very long hours in the yards, which was a pretty dangerous place apart from anything else. And when they weren't at work, they were in the Home Guard, and they were up in the hills and things overnight and all that. So it was just what I picked up from them was a sense that they did their bit, during the war. It did affect them in various ways. I mean, my father ended up in a TB sanatorium for 18 months during the war, and I think it was the conditions they lived and worked in that caused that, and my two uncles both ended up, they died prematurely, they died quite young. And I think it was the effect of the war on them in later years, So that was the experience I picked up. But I did pick up lots of stories. I mean, one of the things I remember hearing was about the major brawls that used to take place in Greenock between Americans and Canadians and Czechs and Poles and all sorts, Greenock was a sort of a hive for that kind of activity because of the port, and the shipping. So there you go. I just wanted to chip in a wee bit of personal story.
Greenock hasn't changed anyway. There's still plenty of rhymes in Greenock.
I think that actually that idea of the dangers of being in reserved occupations, when you said that's something that definitely did come out of quite a lot of the interviews that they would, when they talked about jobs contributing to the war effort. I can think of a few who said it was more dangerous. He said there was one man I remember talking about a friend of his who had been in the army and towards the end of the war and had been posted up into the Highlands and swarmed about on beaches. I think he described it as where he was working hours and hours a day in a very dangerous job, and that he was facing far more dangers than this friend of his in the military services was. So I do remember that coming out of quite a few interviews, that actually the sense that they were contributing more than some in the armed services. And I definitely think in cases where family members and friends were doing the same kind of job and were all working in reserved occupations together and there was community involvement in it, I think there was a much greater acceptance of what they were doing. I think the sense of emasculation or guilt, I suppose, that I talked about tended to come more out of more from people who knew a lot of other people who were in the armed forces, so who had been called up. And I think that came out more then than if they had friends coming back from the forces, and we're seeing that happen. I think Henry Elder, whose quote that I played from his interview, he had another story in his interview about going to the cinema and being turned away because he wasn't wearing a uniform because the cinema was full and he was seen as less important going in, and he was going in with a friend who was in a uniform, I think in a Merchant Navy badge, so actually still in a reserved occupation, but because he had a badge he was able to go into the cinema. I think what people around them were doing was quite important to whether or not they felt guilty about being at home or whether they didn't.
I think we'll come to the last few questions. I've seen Ian wave his hand. Ian, do you have a question for Alison?
I do. Thanks very much, Philippa, and thank you, Alison. And first of all, apologies for joining late, everybody. Had a few technological issues my end, so I missed a chunk of the start. So you may have tackled this already, Alison, and if you have, just cut me off. Basically, it's a kind of methodological question I've got, really, around your use of archival material, archived interviews, as opposed to your own. Did you have to think your way through any particular issues or concerns around using that type of material when, of course, you didn't conduct the interviews, you don't really know the ethics thereof, and those kind of things? Could you just comment on that a little bit, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose they were quite different. The ones, I'm not sure at what point you came in, but I did about 50 of my own, and then explored lots in some of the other collections, but obviously the ones in the other collections were quite... One of the biggest collections that I worked with, the 2000 Glasgow Lives collection, was quite a series of about 650 quite general interviews about Glasgow and Clydeside and people's experiences of living in Glasgow and Clydeside. And these weren't digitised or catalogued in any way at the time, so it was a case of spending a lot of time listening to them and seeing if there was anything in them about work. They just have a wee checklist on the front that said sort of work, religion, whatever was in it, and ticked off or not, so it may or may not. So I listened to quite a few, not sure if they would have anything about reserved occupations in them because they weren't geared towards what I was asking about. So obviously that was quite a time-consuming issue that I came up against, just having to try and guesstimate a little bit what was in the interviews, and I think also things like the time periods that they were interviewed in, and that some of the collections that I looked at were sort of about 20-30 years before the interviews I carried out. And while I think that reserved occupations are still not widely recognised as to what they are in society, that there have been, from the 1980s, the 1990s onwards, there have been various commemorative events. There's one in Falkirk in the 90s, which recognised the reserved occupations. So I think there's a bit more recognition of what they were now when I did my interviews to what was the case when those interviews were carried out. So it was really only if they happened to mention it in those ones that it would... So it's perhaps less likely that it would come up or that they would talk extensively about it. And actually, I tried to recontact a few people who did talk about it in the existing archives to see if I could re-interview them. And quite a few of them weren't around anymore at the time, but of those who were, the only one that I did manage to get in touch with, I talked a wee bit about being in a reserved occupation, but he was adamant when I phoned him to ask him if he'd be interviewed again. He was adamant that he hadn't been, even though in this interview that I'd listened to, he talked about being in one, and so almost going the other way and suggesting that he wasn't in a reserved occupation at all, and so I kind of left it at that. So so I think the passage of time is obviously an impact there. I think Joanna Dornoch has written quite a bit about using existing oral history archives, and I read quite a bit of her work when I was using those, using the collections that I did, and using them for purposes other than that they were created for.
Okay. I think I can see one last question from Sandy, and unless there are any short questions, we'll probably leave it there, so we've made you work a long time. Sandy?
Just to mention that there were benefits in being in a reserved occupation other than the obvious ones of not getting killed in France. My father worked for Anglo-American Oil Company, which later became Esso, and he was based at Bowling down the Clyde, which is where the American oil tankers would come in. And there were big oil tanks there that obviously kept the fuel arriving in this country. And I think there must have been a fair bit of black market activity went on with these American sailors, because a family legend tells of myself at the age of 2 on a day trip to Helmsburgh as the train passed Bowling in a crowded carriage. I said in a very loud voice, "Is that where Daddy gets the butter?"
Actually, I did come across an anecdote in the Glasgow Museum's collection of a man who talked about carrying a multitude of cigarette packets down his trousers out of one of the ships with him. So yeah, that made me think of that. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think we'll draw to a close there. Alison, thank you so much. Utterly enthralling, really. So would you join with me in thanking our speaker for tonight again? And at that point, I think I will wave goodbye to everybody out there. Oh, Ian, you have a point. Yes, I should advertise the next seminar. Maybe I'll let you advertise the next seminar.
Thank you, Philippa. I'm sure you know what it is, but just to remind everybody, our next seminar is on Wednesday, December the 5th. It's been given by Hamish Johnson, and Hamish is going to be talking on Matthew Forster Heddle, the unknown pioneer of Scotland's mountains, or mountaineers. So all welcome as before on December the 5th. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Right, I really will wave goodbye now. Bye-bye. Thank you for coming.
This call has been disconnected. Thank you for joining.